spoiled sister demanded I buy her a house when I helped my brother with his medical bills. When I said no, mom threatened no contact, then tried to give her control of the family business. I, 36F, have 2 siblings, Damon, 34M, my brother, and Nancy, 28F, my sister. The simplest way to put it is this: Nancy was, and always has been, the golden child, especially in my mother's eyes. Dad had some sense. He'd occasionally tell Nancy to cut it out, but even he gave her significantly more leeway than he ever gave Damon or me. Mom? Forget it. She'd let Nancy get away with absolutely anything. Nancy was what my parents lovingly referred to as a surprise. She came along much later than Damon and me, and I genuinely believe that age gap contributed heavily to the preferential treatment. From the moment she could walk and talk, she was treated differently. It's difficult to articulate precisely how it manifested, but it was pervasive. More attention, bigger presence, constant praise. Simply more of everything positive. And if she misbehaved? No consequences. Mom would laugh it off like it was the most adorable thing in the world. Growing up in the shadow of a favorite sibling is a uniquely painful experience. It chips away at your self-worth. You constantly feel inadequate, like you're perpetually in second place, or, in my case, third. You start to internalize the idea that you're simply not as good, no matter how hard you try. The most damaging aspect was Mom's blatant refusal to acknowledge the favoritism. If Nancy said something cruel, and believe me, she had a talent for it, Mom would dismiss our hurt feelings, claiming we were too sensitive or that Nancy was only joking. But it was never a joke. You could see it in Nancy's eyes, in the slight, satisfied smirk she'd get. She enjoyed making us feel small. I remember one time, when I was about 12, I got a new dress that I was really excited about. Nancy took one look at me and said, "It makes you look even wider than usual." Mom just chuckled and said, "Oh, Nancy, don't be silly." But I felt my face burn with shame. It was a constant pattern. It felt like our family was divided into 2 teams, Mom and Nancy against the world, and then Dad, Damon, and me, constantly on the defensive. And even Dad wasn't a reliable teammate. He'd often switch sides, seemingly to keep the peace. So, what specific kinds of things did Nancy do? It was a constant barrage of negativity, aimed at anything and everything. My appearance, Damon's career aspirations, our life choices, nothing was off limits. She had a knack for finding your insecurities and exploiting them. The Thanksgiving incident with Damon is a prime example. He was excitedly discussing his literature major, his passion for books and writing. Nancy, without missing a beat, called him an unemployed burden right there at the dinner table, in front of the entire extended family. The silence that followed was deafening. Dad mumbled something about Nancy being out of line, but Mom just gave her that indulgent smile she always had. Another time, after a particularly grueling week at work, I was venting to Nancy about how exhausted I was. She seized on that, launching into a tirade about how I looked absolutely haggard and that my long hours meant I'd never find a boyfriend, she said, and I remember the exact words because they stung so badly. "You look like you haven't slept in days, and honestly, no guy wants a workaholic hag who looks like she's aged 10 years in the past too." I went completely silent for weeks after that. I just couldn't bring myself to talk to her. It wasn't just us, either. She'd treat friends, extended family, even strangers with the same casual disdain. Anyone who wasn't Mom was fair game. Damon and I, we understandably developed a deep resentment. We resented Nancy for her cruelty, but we resented Mom even more for enabling it. I remember one particularly heated argument with Damon, where I said, "We hated her for that," referring to Mom's unwavering support of Nancy's behavior. It sounds harsh, I know, but that's the raw, unfiltered truth of how we felt. Part of what made it so difficult to cope with, I think, was Nancy's physical appearance. She was conventionally attractive. I know it sounds incredibly petty to admit, but it's relevant. It's easier to dismiss insults from someone you consider your equal, or even someone you see as less than you. But when someone who is widely considered beautiful tells you that you're not, it carries more weight. It plants a seed of doubt in your mind. I started to question my own appearance, my own worth. I think, looking back with the benefit of hindsight and therapy, that Nancy's constant need to put others down stemmed from her own deep-seated insecurities. She didn't have a traditional career path. She dabbled in freelance graphic design, but it was more of a hobby than a profession. She relied heavily on our parents, financially and emotionally. Perhaps belittling others was her way of compensating for her own perceived shortcomings. Me and Damon tried to disregard what she said, up until we were 25. Everything shifted dramatically 8 years ago, when our father passed away. He was, in many ways, the glue that held our fractured family together, despite his own contribution to the imbalance. He wasn't perfect, he definitely indulged Nancy's behavior more than he should have. But he was the one who occasionally tried to mediate, to smooth things over, to maintain some semblance of normalcy. With his death, that fragile relationship shattered. After he was gone, Damon and I began to drift away from Mom and Nancy. It started subtly, with fewer phone calls, less frequent visits. We'd still see them at major family gatherings, the occasional holiday, and maybe Christmas, but only some years, if we felt like it. That phrase, if we felt like it, became our mantra. Then, it became a conscious choice. We actively started avoiding them. A wall, as I've come to describe it, solidified between us and them. And, honestly, I personally liked the wall. It provided a much-needed buffer. It meant less exposure to Nancy's barbs, less witnessing Mom's infuriating enabling. Initially, after Dad's illness and eventual death, we made genuine efforts to maintain contact. We felt a sense of obligation, I suppose. But those attempts were incredibly strained. Every phone call, every visit, felt forced and awkward. And inevitably, during those limited interactions, Mom would say or do something that reinforced our desire for distance. She'd make some glowing comment about Nancy's non-existent accomplishments, or subtly criticize our choices, reminding us why we were pulling away in the first place. One particularly awkward Christmas dinner, Mom spent the entire evening praising Nancy's artistic talent, showing off some truly awful designs Nancy had supposedly created for a major client, who turned out to be a distant cousin. Meanwhile, she completely ignored Damon's recent promotion and my successful completion of a major project at work. It was a stark reminder of the dynamic we were trying to escape. Eventually, Damon and I started making excuses, and they became increasingly elaborate. We were swamped with work, we had prior commitments, we were coming down with something. Anything to avoid spending time with them. We realized that the emotional toll of those interactions far outweighed any perceived familial obligation. There was a silent, unspoken understanding between Damon and me. We both recognized the dysfunction, and we both tacitly agreed that distance was the best solution. It wasn't that we didn't feel like visiting after Dad was gone, it was that we actively chose not to. It wasn't about disrespecting his memory, it was about protecting our own mental and emotional well-being. And, crucially, Mom and Nancy didn't make any significant effort to maintain contact either. They weren't constantly calling, pleading with us to visit. It was a mutual, unspoken agreement to drift apart. We were all financially stable, there was no practical need for frequent interaction. It was simply easier to exist in separate orbits. The silence was a relief. A few years ago, Damon had a nasty accident and fractured his ankle. He was in between jobs at the time, pouring all his energy and resources into launching an online magazine. Money was tight, and the medical bills were piling up. I'm fortunate enough to be the CFO of a successful company, so I offered to help him cover the expenses. He initially refused, being the fiercely independent person he is, but I insisted. I didn't want him to deplete his savings right before his magazine was about to launch. I covered everything, his medication, the extensive physiotherapy he needed, and even the cost of a full-time nurse to assist him during his recovery. To me, it was a no-brainer. It wasn't about the money, it was about helping my brother, someone I genuinely cared about and wanted to see succeed. It was an act of sibling love and support. This act of generosity, however, inadvertently set a dangerous precedent in the minds of Nancy and my mother. Because a few weeks later, I received a phone call from Nancy that left me speechless. It was so audacious, so utterly bizarre, that I initially thought she was joking. She informed me that she wanted to buy a penthouse apartment, not just any apartment, a penthouse, and she needed my financial assistance. She justified this outrageous request by stating that she was embarrassed to still be living with our mother at the age of 28, and since I had helped Damon, it was only fair that I help her too. She conveniently neglected to mention that she only had enough money to cover half the cost of this luxury apartment. My immediate reaction was a mixture of disbelief and simmering anger. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was usually punctuated by Nancy's insults and negativity. And now, out of the blue, she was demanding a massive sum of money? It was surreal. We hadn't had a genuine, meaningful conversation in years. The last time we'd interacted, she'd been busy criticizing my life choices, questioning my career, and making snide remarks about my appearance. The audacity was breathtaking. I tried to wrap my head around her career, or lack thereof. She called herself a freelance graphic designer, but it was more of a casual hobby than a legitimate profession. She had no formal training, no degree, no real portfolio to speak of. She'd designed a couple of posters for Dad's business years ago, and they hadn't even been used. She pretended to have a roster of exclusive clients, but they were primarily family friends, roped in by Mom's relentless pressure. It certainly wasn't a career that could support the purchase of a penthouse. So, I delivered a firm no. I told her, point blank, that I was not going to finance her extravagant lifestyle. I suggested, perhaps a bit too bluntly, that she consider getting a real job if she wanted to afford such luxuries. I know it wasn't the most diplomatic response, but I was genuinely flabbergasted by her entitlement. She, predictably, did not take my refusal well. She launched into a furious tirade, accusing me of favoritism towards Damon. She shrieked about how I'd readily helped him with his medical expenses, and how it was my duty as the oldest sibling to support her, too. She completely ignored the fact that Damon's situation was a genuine emergency, while hers was a self-inflicted desire for luxury. I tried to remain calm, but my patience was wearing thin. I repeated my refusal, emphasizing that I was not a bank, and that I was not responsible for funding her unrealistic aspirations. I was so incredibly annoyed by her sense of entitlement, her complete lack of self-awareness. It was as if she genuinely believed she was owed this penthouse, simply by virtue of being my sister. The conversation escalated into a full-blown argument, with Nancy's voice rising to a near hysterical pitch. I finally just said, no, one last time, and then I hung up the phone. I couldn't listen to another second of her screeching. She called back repeatedly, but I ignored every call. I was done. It was crystal clear that our relationship, or whatever semblance of a relationship we had, was purely transactional for her. She only contacted me when she wanted something, with no regard for my feelings, or the years of strained silence between us. It was utterly exhausting. Predictably, the drama didn't end with Nancy's tantrum. My mother called me next, and the conversation was even more infuriating. She started with a whiny, passive-aggressive tone, lamenting how unfair I was being to Nancy, accusing me of blatantly playing favorites. She claimed I owed them, that I was somehow indebted to them for the mere fact of my upbringing. Then, she dropped a crucial piece of information. Nancy had actually approached our uncle, Dad's brother, who had taken over the family business, before coming to me. He had, wisely, rejected her request. This revealed the depth of their desperation, and the fact that I was their second choice only fueled my anger. A bit of necessary background: I had deliberately chosen a career path outside the family business. I didn't want to be involved. Neither did Damon, and, frankly, neither did Nancy, until it suited her to pretend otherwise. After Dad passed away, his brother took over the reins, and Mom lived comfortably off Dad's shares in the company, shares that had been legally transferred to her as part of his will. Mom then confessed that their financial situation was somewhat precarious, largely due to Nancy's extravagant spending habits. She said that giving Nancy the money for the penthouse would make things easier for her in the future, essentially admitting that she wanted me to subsidize Nancy's lifestyle so she wouldn't have to. She then resorted to the classic guilt trip, threatening no contact if I refused to comply with their demands. This, frankly, was laughable, considering we were already at a state of very low contact. I calmly pointed out this hypocrisy, telling her that it wasn't my problem, and that Nancy could either get a job or continue living with her until she was 35, for all I cared. My anger, which had been simmering for years, finally boiled over. I unleashed a torrent of pent-up frustration. I told her she had absolutely no right to accuse me of playing favorites, when she had been doing precisely that for my entire life. I reminded her that Damon and I had made our peace with her blatant favoritism years ago, that we had accepted the reality of our dysfunctional family dynamic. I stated, unequivocally, that I didn't owe them anything. That I had my own life, my own responsibilities, and my own priorities. She responded with more yelling, accusing me of being ungrateful and disrespectful. She screamed that she never wanted to speak to me again. I chuckled because, realistically, what difference would that make? We barely spoke as it was. I pointed out my upcoming wedding, highlighting the fact that I didn't need her presence in my life. Then, I hung up the phone and blocked both her and Nancy on every platform imaginable. I should probably clarify a significant detail I didn't mention earlier. I'm engaged to a wonderful, supportive man named Andrew, 37M. We've been together for almost 5 years, and he's been incredibly understanding about the complexities of my family situation. Initially, I'd considered inviting Mom and Nancy to the wedding, purely out of a sense of obligation, a desire to maintain some semblance of family harmony. But after that explosive phone call, that consideration vanished completely. However, the aftermath of the confrontation wasn't as straightforward as I'd hoped. Mom, unable to contact me directly, messaged Andrew on social media. She poured out her highly biased, version of events, expressing her profound disappointment in me and declaring that she was permanently cutting me off. And, despite knowing I was in the right, I felt a bit guilty. It's a strange, irrational feeling, that societal conditioning that tells you family is everything, no matter how toxic the relationship may be. Plus, Andrew initially struggled to understand the situation fully. He comes from a very close-knit, loving, and supportive family. The concept of a mother and sister behaving so maliciously was completely foreign to him. He initially felt a degree of sympathy for Mom and Nancy, viewing them as the aggrieved parties. He couldn't quite grasp the depth of the dysfunction. This created a temporary, but significant, strain between us. I found myself having to justify my actions, to explain, yet again, the history of the situation. So, Reddit, Aita? I genuinely don't believe I am. But I'm open to hearing your perspectives. And if you've managed to read this entire, sprawling narrative, thank you. Update 1. Thankfully, the support I received online, from strangers on Reddit who had read earlier of this saga, was incredibly validating. Their comments, their shared experiences, their unwavering support helped to quell those nagging doubts. They reminded me that I wasn't alone, that my feelings were valid, and that I had every right to protect myself from toxic people, even if those people were family. And Damon, as always, reinforced everything the online commenters were saying. He reminded me of countless instances of Mom and Nancy's manipulative behavior, of their consistent negativity, of their complete lack of empathy. He validated my feelings, assuring me that I wasn't being unreasonable, that I wasn't overreacting. He'd lived through it too, after all. He understood. The most crucial turning point, however, was when Damon sat down with Andrew and explained the situation from his perspective. He provided specific examples, detailed the history of the family dynamic, and painted a clear picture of the emotional toll it had taken on both of us. Hearing it from Damon, someone who had witnessed the dysfunction firsthand, made all the difference. Andrew's opinion shifted almost instantly. He finally understood. He saw the situation for what it was, a toxic, deeply unhealthy family dynamic that I needed to escape from. He apologized for his initial doubts, admitting that his own positive family experiences had blinded him to the reality of my situation. He even commented that his own parents would never behave in such a way. He became my staunch supporter, fully backing my decision to sever ties with Mom and Nancy. So, we took action. We blocked them. Me, Damon, and Andrew, all of us, on every platform. Update 2. Just when I thought the drama was finally over, things took another unexpected turn. My uncle, Dad's brother, the one who had taken over the family business, contacted me and Damon with an urgent matter. He sounded deeply concerned, almost frantic. He informed us that Mom was planning to transfer a substantial portion of her shares in the company to Nancy. And not just any shares, she intended to give Nancy voting shares, granting her significant control over the business. His reaction was immediate. He thought it was an absolutely terrible idea, a recipe for disaster. He knew, as we all did, that Nancy was utterly incompetent when it came to business matters. She had zero experience, zero understanding, and zero interest in anything beyond her own superficial desires. Giving her voting power in the company was, in his view, a catastrophic mistake that could potentially jeopardize the entire enterprise. He explained that Mom, while technically possessing voting power herself, had always deferred to his judgment. She had never interfered with the running of the business, trusting him to make sound decisions. He was deeply worried that this would change if Nancy gained control. He envisioned endless arguments, power struggles, and potentially disastrous decisions driven by Nancy's whims and Mom's blind favoritism. He explicitly stated that he did not want to have to engage in constant battles with them over every aspect of the business. Damon and I were immediately concerned. We knew the company's success was vital, not just for our uncle, but for the livelihoods of many employees. We also felt a sense of responsibility, a lingering loyalty to our father's legacy. We came to the reluctant conclusion that we couldn't simply stand by and watch this happen. We felt a moral obligation to intervene, to try to prevent what we saw as an impending disaster. We decided to talk to our mother, despite the strained relationship and the recent, explosive confrontation. We felt a particular responsibility towards our uncle, who had been incredibly supportive and kind to us after Dad's death. He had, as I mentioned before, really looked out for us, and we couldn't, in good conscience, leave him to deal with this potential mess on his own. We were worried about the future of the business, and we felt a sense of duty to protect it, even if it meant facing Mom and Nancy again. Update 3. We braced ourselves and went to see Mom, fully aware that Nancy would be present, and that her presence would make the conversation infinitely more difficult. We knew it wouldn't be pleasant, but we felt it was necessary. As expected, Nancy was there, perched beside Mom like a venomous bird. We launched straight into the issue, expressing our strong opposition to the plan of giving Nancy voting shares. We called it a completely stupid idea, mincing no words. Mom, initially, adopted a strategy of stony silence, refusing to acknowledge our presence or our concerns. She simply ignored us, as if we weren't even in the room. Then, she shifted tactics, claiming we had absolutely no right to interfere in her decisions, that she had no interest in speaking to us. Nancy, predictably, shrieked about how we were jealous of her, how we had never taken the opportunity to be involved in the family business ourselves, and how we were acting as if we owned the place. Her voice reached a fever pitch, her face contorted with rage. It was a deeply unpleasant and stressful scene. I tried, desperately, to reason with Mom, to appeal to her sense of logic and responsibility. I reminded her, repeatedly, that Dad had explicitly stated, on numerous occasions, that he didn't want any of his children involved in the day-to-day running of the company. He had trusted his brother, our uncle, implicitly, and he had wanted to avoid any potential family squabbles or legal battles. I emphasized that I had deliberately chosen a different career path because of Dad's wishes, out of respect for his vision. I begged her, practically pleaded with her, to reconsider her decision, to think about the potential consequences, the damage she could be inflicting on the company, on our uncle, and on everyone who depended on the business for their livelihood. Nancy, throughout my attempts at reasoned discussion, continued her tirade, screaming accusations of jealousy, resentment, and interference. She even went so far as to threaten to call the police on us, as if we were trespassers, intruders in our own mother's home. It was a truly unhinged display of entitlement and rage. I think, at her core, Nancy was terrified. She knew, deep down, that her financial security, her entire lifestyle, was dependent on Mom's continued control of the company. And the prospect of losing that security, of being forced to stand on her own 2 feet, filled her with panic. Also, I do believe, that during Nancy's fit, my mother was silent, to make me feel bad. Like I was attacking her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mom silenced everyone. She told us, in a cold, dismissive tone, that we had been very disrespectful and insulting, and she ordered us to leave. She said she would think about what we'd said and inform our uncle of her decision. Nancy, of course, remained by her side. Damon and I left. We'd done our best. We'd presented our case clearly and forcefully. We'd appealed to Mom's sense of reason, to her loyalty to Dad's wishes, to her concern for the company's future. But we honestly didn't know if it had made any difference. We hoped she would reconsider, but we were prepared for the worst. I had a conversation with Andrew, recounting the events, and I told him that even if it did not go our way, at least we tried. Update 4. 2 agonizing weeks crawled by. Then, our uncle contacted us again, bearing good news. He informed us that Mom had, after much deliberation, agreed not to grant Nancy voting rights in the company. She was, instead, going to transfer preferred shares to her, which would provide Nancy with a stable income stream, but no control over the company's operations. It was a massive relief. The company, at least for the foreseeable future, was safe from Nancy's potential mismanagement. Our uncle could continue to run it effectively, without the constant threat of interference. And, most importantly for me and Damon, we remained no contact with Mom and Nancy. That was the ultimate victory. The entire situation had been incredibly stressful. It was strange, having to intervene in a matter that, technically, wasn't our direct concern. But we felt morally obligated to act, to protect our uncle, to honor our father's wishes, and to safeguard the company's future. Edit. I should clarify something, to address potential questions or assumptions. Some people, after reading earlier, jumped to the conclusion that Dad had left us, his other children, with nothing. That's simply not true. He did leave us assets, separate and distinct from the company shares. I hadn't mentioned those assets previously because I didn't consider them directly relevant to the core conflict, which centered around Nancy's entitlement and Mom's enabling behavior. But to set the record straight, yes, we did inherit other things. Dad wasn't completely oblivious to Nancy's flaws. He wasn't, as I put it before, definitely not in the same boat as my mother. He just had a softer spot for her, a tendency to indulge her more than he should have. I prefer not to dwell on the negative aspects of his personality. I want to remember him fondly. The crucial point is that we weren't financially dependent on Mom or Nancy. We had our own resources, our own careers, our own lives. Update 5. So, here we are, months later. The no contact order remains firmly in place. It's been blissfully peaceful. My wedding is just a week away, and the invitations have long since been sent out. And, unsurprisingly, Mom and Nancy were not included on the guest list. Our relatives, the ones we do maintain contact with, have kept us informed of the fallout. Apparently, Mom and Nancy are absolutely flipping out. They learned about the wedding from our uncle, who, of course, was invited. They've been actively trying to sabotage the event, contacting other family members and attempting to dissuade them from attending, spreading lies and distortions about me, painting themselves as the innocent victims. It's pathetic, predictable, and utterly unsurprising. It's a classic example of their manipulative, attention-seeking behavior. They can't stand the thought of me being happy, of moving on with my life without them. The relationship I have cultivated with Andrew is the complete opposite of what I grew up with. He is loving, kind, supportive, and honest. He showed me that family should not be conditional. Remember those cruel, cutting insults Nancy used to hurl at me? About how I'd end up an unemployed, lonely, workaholic hag? Well, the joke's on her, as they say. I'm none of those things. I'm happy, successful, and about to marry the love of my life. And Damon? He's proving all the doubters, all those who dismissed his passion for literature, wrong.